Hola a todos nuestros amigos de Una Fe Relevante, estamos muy emocionados porque hoy tenemos un episodio muy especial, tenemos una invitada. Antes de hablar de la invitada, quiero decirles que las preguntas de las que vamos a hablar, sé que son preguntas profundamente importantes, profundamente reales en nosotros, y hoy tuvimos la oportunidad de estar con la doctora Rebecca McLaughlin. Ella es doctora, tiene un doctorado en literatura de la Universidad de Cambridge, tiene una licenciatura en teología de Oak Hill College en Londres, es conferencista, autora y actualmente dedica su tiempo, entre muchas otras cosas, a entrenar profesores universitarios y líderes en diferentes campos profesionales para que puedan ser comunicadores efectivos de su fe. Y escribió un importantísimo libro que se llama Confronting Christianity, Confrontando el Cristianismo, 12 preguntas difíciles para la religión más grande del mundo. Estamos muy emocionados de tenerla. Como su libro aún no está en español, vamos a entrevistarla con cosas acerca de las cuales habla en su libro, que son cruciales para nuestra fe. Vamos a hablar de ciencia, vamos a hablar de sexualidad y de varios temas que son importantes entender como creyentes y no creyentes. Entonces, welcome to a Relevant Faith, Dr. McLaughlin. We're so glad to have you with us. It is a tremendous privilege.
I'm delighted to join you.
All right, so...
I'm sorry I'm too stupid to be able to speak Spanish.
It's okay. It's okay. We will.
I sometimes say I'm the only kind of immigrant to America who's too stupid to speak another language.
Well, the Americans and in general, people from the U.S. don't like to speak Spanish that much. We'll try to change that. We'll try to invite them in the Spanish conversation and get them to learn. All right, so we're so excited to have you. The first thing I would like us to talk about is there's several questions regarding faith. People see faith as anti-intellectualism. They see faith as bigotry and homophobia. And they see faith as colonialism, as a religion from white middle-aged Europeans that want us to believe what they believe so they can control us. That's basically a lot of the argument. And there's also coercion in the academic field to be ashamed, if you're a Christian, of believing myths while you're studying in an academic intellectual institution. So I want to tackle those kinds of questions with you today.
Great.
The first one would be, one of the most common questions I get is, has cosmology and biology discarded Christianity? Do we not need Christianity anymore now that we can explain where we come from? Now that we know our origins, can we just discard it?
Yeah. It's a very common idea, both actually among Christians and among those who would not identify as Christians at all, that science is somehow offering an alternative hypothesis to Christianity. So the idea that if we can figure out scientifically how things have come about, and particularly how what we Christians might call creation came about, then that removes the need to think about God. And one of the things that interests me about that idea, and I think it's a misconception, is that actually the people who first invented what we now call science were Christians. And it wasn't just coincidental. Like, they happened to be Christians. They also had some great ideas about how to study the natural world. But actually, they came up with what we now use as the modern scientific method because of their beliefs about God. And the person who has taught me most about this is a man named Hans Halvorsen, who is a professor at Princeton University, one of the top universities in America. And he's one of the leading philosophers of science in the world. And he points out that the first modern scientists believed that God was rational and that he was free. And because God is rational, they thought, well, if there's a creator God who made this whole world, and the God that we meet in the Bible is a God who has rational thinking and consistent lawmaking, that maybe there are actually also consistent laws that undergird how this universe works. And so maybe those are laws as well that creatures like us who are made, as the Bible puts it, in God's image might be able to figure out.
Okay.
But then also because they believed that God was free, they thought, God could have made the universe any way he liked. And so you can't just sit in your armchair and dream up how God might have made the universe. You actually have to go and look. And so these are two of the foundational principles for the philosophical ideas that gave rise to modern science. And Hans Halvorsen, again, this Princeton professor, says that even today, Christianity provides a better philosophical foundation for science than atheism does. In fact, he says atheism doesn't provide a philosophical foundation for science at all. So rather than the first scientists coming up with ideas about the universe as an alternative hypothesis to belief in a creator God, they actually came up with those ideas because they believed that there was one God who was in control of the whole universe, and so they could expect the universe to function in certain ways. Now, clearly, over the last sort of 400 or so years since what we call the scientific revolution, there have been times when Christians have very sort of publicly resisted and opposed scientific discoveries. That's absolutely true. But there are a few important things to notice. One is that there have also been Christians who have led the scientific discoveries. One great example would be the Big Bang, which was actually dreamt up by a Catholic priest.
Wow.
Was ridiculed at the time by some leading atheist physicists because they thought it sounded ridiculous, this idea of the universe coming from this tiny little, very dense, very energetic sort of dot and exploding into the world. That sounded much too much like God saying, "Let there be light," as the Bible puts it. So we actually have many sort of scientific heroes of the last 400 years who are very serious, committed Christians. And we'll also notice that in every seeming debate where it's like Christians on one side and science on the other, there are actually Christians, very serious Bible-believing Christians on both sides of each of those questions through the years.
Wow.
So the idea that science is sort of intrinsically anti-Christian or an alternative hypothesis doesn't wash, I think. And the idea that Christians have always opposed science and that somehow science sort of belongs to atheism also doesn't really wash. And today, one of the most fun things in the last decade of my life has been meeting some of the absolute top scientists in the world in everything from evolutionary biology to cosmology to psychology, who are also very serious Christians. So I don't think we have to choose between a scientific understanding of the world and a Christian understanding of the world.
That's massive, mostly because we live in an environment in which people use science as a weapon against belief. Like they want to use science as what science doesn't do. So would it be appropriate to say that science is more concerned, and I'm asking this as someone who has used this argument, science seeks to answer more the how question than the why question. There are philosophical answers that science simply doesn't care about because it's not its job.
Yeah, absolutely. I like how, as a Cambridge professor called Russell Coburn, who is an experimental physicist, and the way he puts it is that people sometimes have this idea that the more we understand of science, the sort of smaller our view of God becomes because we only attribute, God's action to the bits that we don't understand. He says, actually, the more we understand of science, it's like seeing God's creative activity in more detail. So just as you're saying, science can tell us how things happen. It can't tell us why. And it doesn't give us an alternative to the idea of there being a creator God who's in charge of the whole thing. And I think, again, this is a place where both Christians and atheists can sometimes misunderstand or misrepresent the historic Christian position, which is not that God only acts in the miraculous or God only is present in the things that we don't yet understand scientifically, but that actually God's in charge of the whole show.
Yes.
So the more we understand of science, it's like one of the pioneers of the scientific revolution put it, it's like we're thinking God's thoughts after him.
Wow, that's incredible. One of the things I often hear is people saying, okay, well, even if you cannot discard it by hard sciences, you also have psychology. And the fact that psychology is able to answer the question of the soul, basically. We don't need religion if we have psychology. We can just go to the therapist and be fine and deal with our issues, and be open about our issues. So why go to church if I have therapy? So there's this very strong dichotomy in people's minds between what psychology, the science of psychology, and now you have psychology of religion, which I had to take a class. And you think, wow, that's Christian. It's not at all. And they seem to sell the idea that psychology is completely antithetical to Christianity. How can we deal with that?
Yeah, there are two problems with that. One that you've already mentioned, which is that there's this particular relatively recent field called evolutionary psychology religion. And one of the main ideas coming out of that field is that it seems like human beings are naturally more inclined to believe in the supernatural. So we're not, if you don't kind of give human beings an awful lot of other inputs, they're actually more likely to be religious of one form or another than they are to have a sort of atheist mindset. And atheists sometimes will look at this data and say, oh, well, great, because that explains why religion has been quite so hard to eradicate in the world. And in fact, why rather than shrinking in the modern world, religious belief is actually growing. So it's helpful from an atheist perspective to say, okay, maybe this helps to explain why humans haven't got over this crazy religious stuff. From a Christian perspective, actually, the idea that humans have, as the Bible puts it, that God has put eternity in the hearts of men, that there is something within us that makes us want to look for relationship with something so much greater than us, actually is very consistent with a Christian understanding of what human beings are. And as you point out, Justin Barrett, who is widely acknowledged to be the founding father of the whole field of evolutionary psychology of religion, is himself a very serious Christian. He did a lot of his research at Oxford, but he's now actually at Fuller Theological Seminary in America. So the idea that this is a field that has discredited Christianity doesn't wash really with the fact that it was invented by a Christian. But then sort of leaving that aside, if we look at the effect that regular religious participation, for example, going to church once a week or more, has on us as human beings psychologically, it's extraordinarily impressive. And in fact, I wrote an article that's just come out today with the Gospel Coalition about some recent research that came out earlier this month from professors at Harvard who are looking at the phenomenon of what's known as deaths of despair. So that includes suicide, drug abuse, and alcohol-related deaths, which is a massive problem in America, and my guess is a significant problem in Mexico as well. And it turns out that regular church going actually is massively helpful in terms of protecting people against those kinds of deaths. So they found, I think for women, it was about 68% difference between women who went to church once a week or more and women who didn't go to church at all. Wow. And then it was more like sort of 33%. A previous study from that same group, which was looking at just at suicide, showed that women who went to church once a week or more are 5 times less likely to kill themselves than those who never go. And we see these effects also in terms of other areas of mental health, so guarding against depression, having a greater sense of optimism and purpose in life, and actually also in terms of even our physical health. People who go to church once a week or more are physically less likely to die in the next 15 years by extraordinary, it's about 20 to 30% lower mortality. And it also seems to have a real impact on our pro-social behavior and how we treat others. So people sometimes think of Christians as, sometimes with good cause, as sort of selfish, and that really society at large would be better off without Christianity.
Yeah.
Turns out that's just from a purely scientific basis, that's just simply not true. So, one example would be that Christians, and this study is from America, but Christians give 3.5 times as much money to charity as their secular peers. They volunteer twice as much. They're half as likely to engage in domestic violence. So that that's those who are regularly church attending every week. Just saying you're a Christian and never showing, never actually living in Christian community isn't linked to these effects. It's people who are actively engaging in religious community once a week that it shows that an extraordinary positive psychological impact and pro-social impact, actually.
Wow, that's tremendous. Because so what I get is the science itself is showing us that, well, the more Christians act, the more healthy psychologically and the more healthy sociologically they will be for the culture in which they live. So basically living out the faith. And for those who do not believe, we cannot be simplistic by simply discarding it and saying, oh, psychology has dealt with that, because psychology is showing us, well, not so easy. We need religion. That's
which is not, again, I don't want that to sound like faithful Christians don't struggle with mental health challenges.
Yes.
And so it's not the case. And I think there's too often been a culture of sort of shame within churches for Christians to be able to acknowledge
Absolutely.
depression or suicidal ideation or challenges with drug addiction and alcohol abuse. So these things are absolutely certainly present within our Christian family. And if anything, I think that the status should lead us to work harder to love and support brothers and sisters who are struggling in those ways. But if you take a purely kind of public health scientific perspective, actually secularization is, you could describe it as a public health crisis in terms of the negative impacts that it has.
So our Christian psychologists have a lot to say to us today, and Christian and non-Christian psychology is not antithetical to the faith. It would be wrong and simplistic to discard one or the other as...
Right, and one of the things that I found really interesting as I researched for my book, because I talk quite a lot about this in the first chapter, which is titled, Aren't We Better Off Without Religion?
Yes.
That a lot of the findings of modern psychology turn out to be strongly aligned with things that we learn from the Bible. And it's everything from regular, like the practices of regular thankfulness and gratitude are good for you. And that's something that we can learn from the scriptures. Or helping and serving other people is actually very good for you as well. Sometimes it's even better for you than it is for the people that you're serving. And things around self-control, the idea that you're part of something much greater than yourself. And so rather than the universe revolving around you, actually you in community with others are revolving around, for Christians, Jesus.
Yes.
It turns out that that's actually how human beings thrive, rather than having unlimited freedom and the power of self-expression and making everything about me. Actually being other person-centered and in particular being connected to a mission much greater than ourselves turns out to be very psychologically healthy for us.
That's incredible insight, and that moves us to this like very real shame and very real anger toward or regarding Christianity from people from the LGBTQ community, and even people who struggle with homosexuality within the church, and they don't know how to navigate that, and some just leave the faith. And others, like those who look from outside, say Christians are just homophobic bigots. That's what Christianity is a religion of homophobia. And you have both sides. Like, this is not something that's outside the church, but even inside the church. So you can either, people end up apologizing almost, like apologetics can become apologizing when you simply say, oh, we're sorry, we believe X or Y about sexuality. Let's change our beliefs. That's one way in which it has been approached. But looking at your book, you approach it and looking at some of great books like Dr. Sam Alberry, but is God Anti-Gay? That's an amazing little book. I'll pray we have those materials in Spanish soon. How will you respond to that? How will you respond to that at a personal level? Because it's a very personal thing for people. It's not just ideological debate, but it's a personal, deep debate.
Yeah, and it's a very personal thing for me. Were I not a Christian, I think I'd probably be married to a woman rather than a man at this point. I've been happily married to a man for nearly 13 years, but as long as I can remember, I've been far more attracted to women than to men. And growing up, that was something that was sort of perplexing to me, because I was a Christian and I was sort of expected that one day I would get married. And I think I sort of believed that this would happen, despite the fact that I had no, it wasn't my feelings for men that preoccupied my heart in any way, kind of growing up.
So same-sex attracted people is different because the bare thought of being in a church and having that thought, it's condemning to them. How do you deal with that as a young person, as a human being who's dealing with that in the church?
Yeah. And I think one of the important places to start is to recognize that according to the latest research, about 14% of women and about 7% of men experience same-sex attraction.